Ambassador James Mitchell stepped off the transport shuttle and looked around Nexus Station for the first time. The place was huge. Metal corridors stretched in every direction, filled with beings he had only seen in pictures before. Some walked on two legs like humans, others crawled or floated. The air smelled strange, like metal and something sweet he could not name. A tall, thin creature with blue skin and 4 arms approached him. "Welcome to Nexus Station, Ambassador Mitchell. I am Assistant Director Corvin. We have prepared your quarters in the human section." "Thank you," James said, adjusting his black suit jacket. He carried a simple briefcase and smiled politely at everyone they passed. Other beings stared at him with curiosity. Humans were still new to the Galactic Union, and many had never seen one up close. The station was like a small city floating in space. Different sections housed different species, each designed for their specific needs. The human section had normal gravity and air that James could breathe easily. His room was simple but comfortable, with a bed, desk, and a window that showed the stars outside. After settling in, James made his way to the diplomatic offices. The main hall was impressive, with a high ceiling and flags from dozens of different worlds hanging from the walls. Beings of all shapes and sizes moved through the space, conducting business in languages he could not understand. "You must be the new human representative," said a voice behind him. James turned to see a large, reptilian creature with green scales that seemed to change color as he moved. "I am Security Chief Vortak. I oversee safety and protocols here on the station." "Pleased to meet you," James said, extending his hand. Vortak looked at the hand with confusion, then carefully shook it with one clawed finger. "We have scheduled your first formal meeting for tomorrow morning," Vortak continued. "All 12 primary species representatives will attend. The session will be recorded and broadcast to your respective governments, as is our custom." James nodded and smiled. "Actually, I was hoping to make a different arrangement first." "What kind of arrangement?" "I would like to request private meetings with each ambassador before we begin the formal negotiations. One-on-one conversations just to get to know everyone better." Vortak's scales shifted from green to a darker color. "Private meetings? This is unusual. All diplomatic proceedings must be transparent. We record everything for the Union archives." James pulled out a small tablet and showed Vortak a section of text. "According to Article 47 of the Union Charter, any member species may request preliminary informal consultations before official negotiations begin. No recordings required." Vortak read the section twice, his scales continuing to shift colors. "This provision has never been used before. Why do you wish to meet privately?" "I find that people are more honest when they can speak freely, without worrying about how their words will be interpreted by others. I want to understand each species' real concerns before we begin formal talks." "Most concerning," Vortak muttered. He looked around the hall, then back at James. "I will need to confirm this with Union leadership, but technically, you appear to be within your rights." Within hours, word of James's unusual request had spread throughout the diplomatic quarters. In the crystalline section, Ambassador Thylex discussed it with their collective consciousness. "The human wants private meetings. This has never happened before." "Why would they want secrecy?" asked one voice in the collective mind. "Perhaps they plan deception," suggested another. "Or perhaps they have something to hide," added a third. In the warrior quarters, General Krex laughed when he heard the news. "Humans think they can intimidate us with secret talks? Let them try. I have fought in 100 battles. No soft-skinned human frightens me." But other species were more worried. The Merchant Guild representatives gathered in their private chamber, whispering among themselves. "What could humans want that requires such secrecy?" asked Ambassador Zelina. "Their species is known for being unpredictable. Perhaps they plan to offer bribes," suggested another merchant. "Or threaten us individually." "We should refuse these meetings," said a third. "Nothing good comes from breaking established protocols. But refusing would make them look weak or suspicious." The human had found a legal way to request the meetings, and declining might suggest they had something to hide. By evening, Vortak had confirmed with Union leadership that James's request was technically allowed, though highly irregular. One by one, the ambassadors reluctantly agreed to meet with the human diplomat privately. The first meeting was scheduled for the next morning with Ambassador Thylex of the Crystalline Collective. The news made Thylex nervous. For the first time in their existence, they would have to disconnect from the collective consciousness and speak as an individual. The thought was both terrifying and strangely exciting. Vortak spent the evening installing additional security measures. Hidden cameras and listening devices were placed throughout the meeting rooms. If the human was planning something dangerous, he would find out. "What do you think he wants?" asked Assistant Director Corvin as they finished the security preparations. Vorthak's scales shifted to a deep red color. "I do not know, but humans are clever and dangerous. They defeated the Krillian Empire in less than a year when everyone expected them to lose quickly. They must not be underestimated." As night fell on Nexus Station, tensions ran high throughout the diplomatic sections. Tomorrow would bring something unprecedented in Union history: private diplomatic meetings with no witnesses, no recordings, and no established protocols to guide them. James Mitchell sat in his quarters, reviewing files on each species he would meet. But unlike the other diplomats' fears suggested, he was not planning deception or threats. He was preparing for something much simpler and, in its own way, much more dangerous to the established order. He was preparing to listen. The meeting room was small and quiet. Ambassador Thylex entered slowly, their crystalline body catching the light and throwing rainbow patterns on the walls. For the first time in hundreds of years, they had disconnected from the collective consciousness of their species. The silence in their mind felt strange and frightening. James Mitchell stood when Thylex entered. He had removed his formal jacket and wore only a simple white shirt. A small table held 2 cups of water and nothing else. No recording devices were visible anywhere. "Please sit wherever you feel comfortable," James said softly. Thylex remained standing, their crystalline form shifting nervously. "This is very unusual for my kind. We do not often speak as individuals." "I understand this might feel different," James replied. "We can stop anytime you want. I just hoped we could talk about your people not as diplomats, but as beings who care about their families and homes." Thylex slowly sat down, their crystal body making soft chiming sounds. "What do you wish to know?" "Tell me about your homeworld," James said. "What is it like when you are connected to everyone? Do you miss it when you are away?" For 43 minutes they talked. James asked simple questions about Thylex's childhood, about the feeling of shared consciousness, about their fears for young crystalline beings who were just learning to connect with the collective mind. He did not take notes. He did not ask about trade agreements or military alliances. He simply listened. When Thylex left the room, their crystalline form was flickering with unusual light patterns. Other diplomats waiting outside noticed immediately that something had changed. Thylex moved differently, more slowly, as if thinking deeply about something. "What did the human want?" asked General Krex, the large warrior stepping into Thylex's path. Thylex looked at him for a long moment. "He asked me about home. About what it feels like to be part of something larger than myself. About whether I worry that young ones might lose their connection to the collective. That is all." He listened to my answers. Really listened. No one has ever asked me about my feelings about being connected to others. They only ask about our collective decisions or our technology. General Krex frowned. This did not sound like the clever trap he had expected. But he would remain alert during his own meeting. When Krex entered the same small room an hour later, he was prepared for battle. His warrior training had taught him to spot deception and manipulation. But James Mitchell simply offered him water and asked him to sit. "I have read about your people's warrior culture," James began. "It must be difficult being away from your homeworld for so long. Do you miss your family?" Krex blinked in surprise. In decades of diplomatic meetings, no one had ever asked about his personal life. "I have 3 cubs at home. My mate teaches them to fight." "You must worry about them," James said. "Being a father and a warrior must create difficult choices sometimes." For the next hour, Krex found himself talking about things he had never discussed with anyone outside his own species. His fears that his cubs might die in battle before they were ready. His pride in their growing strength. His memories of his own father, who had died fighting to protect their territory. When Krex emerged from the meeting, he was quiet and thoughtful. The other waiting diplomats noticed that his usual aggressive posture had changed. He seemed less like a warrior ready for battle and more like a father thinking about his children. "What happened in there?" demanded Ambassador Zelina of the Merchant Guild. Krex shook his massive head slowly. "He asked me about home. About my cubs. About what it means to be a warrior and a father at the same time. That is all? No threats? No bribes? No secret deals? Nothing like that. He just listened, like he actually cared about my answers." Security Chief Vorthak watched all of this from his hidden cameras, but the recordings showed nothing useful. Every camera mysteriously lost focus when pointed at James Mitchell. Every listening device picked up only static. It was as if the human knew exactly where each monitoring system was placed and somehow blocked them all without any visible technology. Ambassador Zelina's meeting was next. She entered the room expecting to discuss trade routes and profit margins. Instead, James asked her about the merchant ships she had worked on as a young being. He wanted to know about the beauty of traveling between stars, about the excitement of discovering new worlds and new peoples. "Do you ever regret spending so much time in space?" he asked. "Do you miss having a permanent home?" No one had ever asked Zelina such questions. She found herself talking about loneliness, about watching planets pass by through ship windows, about wondering what it would be like to stay in one place long enough to grow roots. When she left the meeting, other diplomats saw tears in her large, dark eyes. The pattern continued throughout the day. Each ambassador entered James Mitchell's simple meeting room expecting political manipulation or clever traps. Instead, they found a human who asked about their families, their hopes, their fears, and their dreams. He wanted to know about their childhood memories, their proudest moments, and their deepest worries. Most disturbing of all, he seemed to genuinely care about their answers. By evening, something unprecedented was happening on Nexus Station. Ancient enemies were having quiet conversations in the corridors. Species that had not spoken peacefully for centuries were sharing stories about their homeworlds. The rigid diplomatic protocols that had governed the station for decades were quietly being ignored as beings discovered they had more in common than they had ever imagined. Vorthak reviewed his useless surveillance footage with growing alarm. Whatever the human was doing, it was working. The careful balance of suspicion and competition that kept the Union manageable was beginning to crumble, replaced by something far more dangerous: understanding. Union President Maxer paced back and forth in his office, his multiple eyes blinking rapidly with worry. Reports were coming in from all over Nexus Station about strange behavior among the ambassadors. His aide, a nervous insect-like being named Crix, read from a long list of unusual activities. The Merchant Guild proposed new trade rules that would actually help smaller species make more profit, Crix reported, his antennae twitching. General Crix sent a message to his home government suggesting peace talks with their oldest enemies. Ambassador Thylex has been seen eating alone in the human section, disconnected from their collective mind. "This is impossible," Maxer muttered. "These species have maintained the same positions for thousands of years. The Merchant Guild only cares about profit. The warrior clans only respect strength. What could have changed them so quickly?" "All the changes started after their private meetings with the human diplomat," Crix noted. Maxer stopped pacing. "Bring them all here. I want answers immediately." Within an hour, all 12 ambassadors gathered in the presidential chamber. The room was large and formal, with a high ceiling and the Union symbol carved into the walls. But something felt different. The ambassadors who normally sat as far apart as possible were standing closer together. Ancient enemies were actually making eye contact and nodding politely to each other. "Explain yourselves," Maxer demanded, his voice echoing in the chamber. "Your government sent you here with specific instructions. Your species have consistent policies that go back centuries. What has changed?" Ambassador Thylex spoke first, their crystal voice softer than usual. "We have been reminded of things we had forgotten, President Maxer. About why our species originally wanted to join the Union. The human helped us see that we share common concerns," added General Crix. His usual aggressive stance had been replaced by something that looked almost like wisdom. "What concerns?" Maxer pressed. "What did he tell you?" "He told us nothing," said Ambassador Zelina. "He asked us to tell him things. About our homes. About our families. About what we hope for our children's futures. And we realized," continued Thylex, "that despite our different forms and cultures, we all want similar things. Safety for our young ones. Peace for our elders. Hope for tomorrow." Maxer felt his skin growing cold. "You are diplomats, not philosophers. You represent your government's interests, not your personal feelings." "But why should those be different things?" asked General Crix. "My government wants security for our people. I want safety for my cubs. These desires point in the same direction." At that moment, Security Chief Vorthak burst into the chamber. His scales were bright red with anger and his claws were extended. "President Maxer, I have evidence that the human is using advanced psychological warfare against our diplomats. I request immediate permission to arrest him." "What evidence?" Maxer demanded. Vorthak held up a data pad. "Every surveillance device fails when pointed at him. Every recording comes back empty or distorted. He is clearly using some form of advanced technology to manipulate minds while blocking our monitoring systems." Perhaps, said Ambassador Thylex quietly, he simply values privacy. Many species prefer to speak freely when they know they are not being recorded. This is not about privacy. Vortex snapped. Look at yourselves. You are acting completely different from when you arrived. The human has done something to you. He listened to us, said Zelina simply. That is not an explanation. Vortex scales shifted to an even deeper red. I am placing the human under arrest for unauthorized psychological manipulation of Union diplomats. Vortex turned toward the door to summon his security team, but found his path blocked. General Krex stepped in front of him, his massive warrior frame casting a shadow over the security chief. You will not arrest the human, Krex said calmly. Move aside, General. This is a security matter. No. Other ambassadors moved to stand beside Krex. Within moments, Vortex found himself facing a united wall of diplomatic representatives. This is madness. Vortex exclaimed. Some of you represent species that have been enemies of humanity. Why are you protecting him? Because he showed us something we had never experienced before, said Thylex. He treated us as individuals, not just as voices for our governments. He asked about our fears and dreams, added Zelina. No diplomat has ever cared about such things before. He made us remember that behind every political position are real beings with real families who just want good lives, said another ambassador. President Maxer stared at the scene in horror. For the first time in Union history, ambassadors from dozens of different species were standing together, united in protecting someone from outside their alliance. Ancient enemies were literally standing side by side. What has he done to you? Maxer whispered. He reminded us that we are more than just representatives of our species, Krex said. We are parents, children, beings who feel joy and sadness and hope. We are individuals who happen to serve our people, not just political tools. This changes everything, Maxer realized. If diplomats start thinking of themselves as individuals first and political representatives second, then maybe we can actually solve problems instead of just managing conflicts, finished Thylex. Vortex looked around at the united group of ambassadors. His security team would never be able to arrest the human now, not with every major diplomatic representative protecting him. But more than that, he was beginning to understand something that terrified him. The human had not used any advanced technology or psychological tricks. He had done something much simpler and much more dangerous to the established order of the Union. He had treated them like people. As news of the confrontation spread through Nexus Station, other species representatives began requesting their own private meetings with human diplomats. The careful system of managed conflicts and controlled negotiations that had kept the Union stable for millennia was beginning to crumble. And it was being replaced by something unprecedented. Genuine understanding between different species. The tension in the corridor was thick as Security Chief Vortex stood face to face with a wall of alien diplomats protecting the human. His security team had arrived but stopped when they saw General Krex and the other ambassadors blocking their path. Never in Union history had diplomats from different species united like this. James Mitchell calmly walked out of the meeting room where he had been conducting his final private session. He looked completely relaxed, as if he did not notice the armed security forces or the angry shouting. His simple briefcase hung at his side, and he still wore the same plain clothes he had worn all week. Ambassador Mitchell, President Maxer called out, his multiple eyes focusing on the human. You will explain what you have done to these diplomats immediately. James looked around at the gathered beings. Some were tall and thin, others short and wide. Some had scales, others had fur, and some seemed to be made of living crystal. But they all stood together, watching him with something that looked like protectiveness. I had conversations with them, James said simply. Vortex scales turned an even brighter red. Do not lie to us, human. You have used some form of advanced mind control. Our diplomats are acting completely different from when they arrived. Yes, they are, James agreed. They seem happier. More relaxed. They are talking to each other instead of just waiting for formal meetings. Is this a bad thing? It is suspicious. Vortex snapped. What technology did you use? What psychological techniques? Our best surveillance equipment could not record anything from your meetings. James reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small, simple recording device. It was the kind that any species could buy at a basic electronics shop. Would you like to hear what I said to them? The corridor fell silent. Everyone stared at the ordinary recording device in James's hand. You recorded the meetings yourself? Maxer asked in confusion. I asked each ambassador if I could make a personal recording, just for my own notes. They all said yes. James set the device on a nearby table. Would you like to hear the questions I asked Ambassador Thylex? Without waiting for permission, he pressed play. His voice filled the corridor. Tell me about your homeworld, Ambassador. What is it like to be connected to so many minds at once? Do you ever feel lonely when you disconnect from the collective? Vorthak looked confused. That is all? James fast-forwarded through the recording. More of his voice played. What worries you most about the young ones in your collective? What do you hope they will learn as they grow older? These are not diplomatic questions, said President Maxer slowly. No, they are not, James agreed. He switched to a different recording. Here is part of my conversation with General Krex. The recording played. You must miss your family when you are away on diplomatic missions. Tell me about your children. What are they like? What do you hope for their futures? General Krex stepped forward. He asked me about my cubs. About my mate. About my father who died in battle when I was young. No diplomat has ever asked me about my family before. But why? Demanded Vorthak. What was the purpose? I wanted to understand them as individuals, James explained. Not as representatives of their governments or species, but as beings with their own hopes and fears and dreams. Ambassador Thylex's crystalline form chimed softly. For the first time in my existence, someone asked me what it felt like to be me. Not what the collective thought, but what I personally experienced. I had never considered that my individual feelings mattered. He asked me if I worried about my cubs growing up in a dangerous galaxy, added Krex. He wanted to know if I felt proud when they showed courage or afraid when they took risks. These are parent feelings, not warrior feelings. But I am both a warrior and a father. Ambassador Zelina nodded. He asked me about the loneliness of traveling between stars. About whether I missed having a home planet. About whether I regretted spending my life in spaceships instead of building relationships planetside. No one had ever asked if I was happy with my choices. President Maxer stared at James with growing understanding and horror. You are telling me that your great diplomatic weapon is caring about their personal lives? Empathy, James corrected gently. The ability to see others as complete beings, not just political tools. Every one of these ambassadors carries the hopes and fears of their entire species, but they are also individuals with their own experiences and emotions. This is impossible, Vorthak muttered. Diplomacy is about managing competing interests between species. Personal feelings do not matter. But they do matter, said Thylex quietly. They matter because we make decisions based on what we truly care about. And what we care about most is not abstract political concepts. We care about our families, our children, our hopes for the future. James nodded. When Ambassador Thylex told me about their fear that young crystalline beings might lose their connection to the collective, we discovered that this connects to trade issues. They want to protect their traditional ways of life, which affects how they approach economic agreements. When General Krex talked about wanting his cubs to grow up in a safe galaxy, James continued, we found common ground with species who also want security for their young ones. Parents from different species have similar concerns. You made them see similarities instead of differences, Maxer said slowly. I helped them remember that behind every political position are real beings with real feelings, James replied. When you understand why someone wants something instead of just what they want, you can find solutions that work for everyone. Vorthak looked around at the united group of ambassadors. Ancient enemies were standing peacefully side by side. Species that had barely spoken for centuries were nodding in agreement with each other. This changes everything, he whispered. Yes, James said simply. It does. 6 months had passed since James Mitchell's first private meetings, and Nexus Station looked completely different. The grand formal meeting halls that once hosted tense negotiations now sat mostly empty. Instead, smaller rooms buzzed with quiet conversations between species that had barely spoken for decades. In the station's central cafe, an unusual sight had become normal. General Krex sat at a table with Ambassador Zelina and 2 other diplomats, sharing pictures of their families on small data screens. The warriors' cubs had grown since he last saw them, and he smiled proudly as he showed off their latest training achievements. My youngest daughter just completed her first solo trade run, Zelina said, her large eyes bright with pride. She was so nervous, but she managed to negotiate a good deal with the mining colonies near the outer rim. The young ones grow so fast, agreed Ambassador Thylex, their crystalline form chiming softly. Sometimes I disconnect from the collective just to remember what it felt like to be young and uncertain about the future. This kind of personal sharing would have been impossible before James Mitchell's visit. but now it happened every day throughout the station. Diplomats who once saw each other only as political opponents had discovered they were parents, children, and beings with hopes and dreams remarkably similar to their own. President Maxer stood in his office, looking out at the station through his large window. His aide Crix buzzed nervously beside him, reading from the daily reports. Trade agreements are up 40%, Crix reported. Military conflicts between member species have decreased by 60%. Scientific cooperation projects have increased by 300%. By every measure, the Union is more successful than it has ever been. And yet you sound worried, Maxer observed. The old system is completely gone, Crix said, his antennae twitching rapidly. Formal protocols are ignored. Representatives make decisions based on personal relationships instead of official government positions. Everything has changed. Maxer continued looking out the window. He could see diplomats walking together in the corridors below, species that had been enemies for centuries now sharing meals and stories. Perhaps change was needed. Sir? The old system kept us stable by keeping us apart, Maxer explained. We managed conflicts by making sure no one got too close to anyone else. But we never actually solved anything. We just maintained the status quo. But orders, sir. Structure. Predictability. Look at the results, Crix. Real results. Our people are safer, more prosperous, and happier than they have been in living memory. Perhaps a little chaos was worth it. Down in the diplomatic quarters, James Mitchell was packing his belongings. His official mission had been completed months ago, but he had stayed to help train other human diplomats in what had become known as the listening method. Now it was time to return to Earth. A soft knock came at his door. Come in, he called. To his surprise, Security Chief Vorthak entered. The large reptilian being looked uncomfortable, his scales shifting through several different colors as he stood in the doorway. I wanted to speak with you before you left, Vorthak said quietly. James gestured to a chair, but Vorthak remained standing. What can I do for you? I spent months trying to figure out what weapon you had used against our diplomats, Vorthak said. I was convinced you had some advanced technology or psychological technique that could control minds. And now? Vorthak's scales shifted to a softer green color. I realized the weapon was much simpler and much more dangerous than I thought. You treated them like people. James smiled. Is that dangerous? To the old system, yes. Very dangerous. Vorthak was quiet for a moment. I have been security chief for 20 years. My job was to watch for threats, to maintain order, to keep different species from getting too close to each other. And now I watch diplomats sharing pictures of their children. I see former enemies working together on projects that benefit everyone. I witness daily acts of kindness between beings who used to barely tolerate each other. Vorthak's scales shifted to a warm blue color. I have never seen the station so peaceful. Then why do you look worried? Vorthak moved closer and sat down heavily in the offered chair. Because I do not know how to do my job anymore. How do you provide security for people who trust each other? How do you maintain order among beings who solve their own problems through friendship? James leaned back in his chair. Maybe those are good problems to have. Perhaps. Vorthak was quiet for a long moment. I have a request. What kind of request? A personal one. The security chief's scales shifted to a nervous yellow color. Would you have one of those private conversations with me? Like you did with the ambassadors? James smiled warmly. Of course. What would you like to talk about? I have never told anyone this, Vorthak began, his scales settling into a soft purple color, but I was not always a security officer. When I was young, I wanted to be an artist. I painted pictures of distant stars and imagined traveling to them someday. For the next hour they talked. Not about security protocols or diplomatic procedures, but about dreams and disappointments, about the path that led a young artist to become a security chief, about the beauty of stars seen from space stations and the loneliness of always watching others instead of participating. When their conversation ended, Vorthak stood with tears in his large, reptilian eyes. Thank you, he said simply. As James Mitchell prepared to board his transport back to Earth, he looked around Nexus Station one last time. Beings from dozens of different worlds moved through the corridors, no longer as suspicious strangers but as friends and colleagues working toward common goals. The fear that had once kept the Union together had been replaced by something much stronger: understanding. And that understanding had spread far beyond the diplomatic quarters. Reports were coming in from across the galaxy of species requesting human-style diplomatic meetings, of ancient conflicts being resolved through personal conversation rather than formal negotiation. The aliens had been right to fear human diplomats who requested private meetings. But not because humans brought weapons of war. They brought something far more revolutionary: the simple, radical idea that every being in the galaxy deserved to be heard, understood, and treated with dignity. As his transport pulled away from the station, James smiled. The real work was just beginning.